Hello, this is Elizabeth Bird again, and I'm here in the book of Genesis to share a Bible study with you. Hope you've had a great time with this, and we are going to continue on to look at God in three ways. As you recall that I like to talk about God and His Word as at in these passages in Scripture. And the first one being that God is a God who's personal. He knows you and me, and He knows us by name. And then second, that God, He really wants a relationship with mankind. And then third, that God is a God of salvation. So then all three of these are always at work at the same time. And some are just come more to the forefront than others in terms of, just everyday events or things that are going on. So we're going to look at something that's happened in life, see how God really comes through as commander. So today we're looking at God as the commander, and he has asked us to do things. So in this case, he's asked a group of people to be fruitful and multiply in the earth. And we're going to see what's happened when we start, and then by the time we finish, see what actually transpires and continues on. Okay, today's question is really about what is God asking us to do? What is God asking me to do? But asking all of us as Christian people, what are we be doing? And that in general, at this time, they're not necessarily Christian. He's asking people in general to do a certain thing, and the location is in a city. So today I'm gonna have you imagine yourself in a city setting where you might be in one location, but like every place around you is really large and there's lots of people. So it's not just you involved. Lots of people are here. Okay. So that's the kind of setting you're going to have, and we're looking at Genesis 11. So I'm going to begin, and we're going to look at Genesis 11. We're going to look at three aspects of God, like I said earlier, the three that I mentioned, in respect for three sections that we're going to look at here. And I'm breaking it down as to God. There's rejection of God. Then we're going to look at the or call it reconnaissance by God, and that He does. And then finally, we're going to look at what the results that occur by and the review that God has at the end. Okay, so those are the three sections we're looking at today, and we're looking at Genesis 1 through 9. So join with me, and I'm using the New International Version. We're going to start with Genesis 11, 1 through 4. Okay, here we go. Genesis 11, 1. Now the world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, this is verse 2, as people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. 3. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. And then 4. They said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we can make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Okay, so there we are in the book of Genesis 11, 1 through 4. As I always say, let me break that down for you. First, let's look about what has happened to this point. So now the setting is that it's after the flood. So it's after Noah and his three sons and their wives, all of their wives that were on the ark. All that has passed. That's in the past now. The population has increased. It's very large. So I would suggest that maybe even we're beyond um, the four men that I just mentioned. We're probably possibly beyond that time. And the point is that we have lots of people together, and and they are deciding to live together in this area. So they've all settled in a place near within Shinar. Okay? Genesis 10 then, of course, describes, and we've looked at that, describes Noah's descendants, and it talks about how the people scattered. Then Genesis 11, we find that they actually have not scattered. So we're going to look at what causes them to scatter. And here we go. So we're looking at Genesis 11:1. And here's some clues in all of this. That they have moved to a plain in Shinar, and they have moved together, and they've decided that they want to build a city with a tower. So they are going to come together, or they've come together, they keep together, and they, interestingly enough, decide they're going to build a city and a tower to honor of all people themselves. And therein is a distinction here. In all of this, we're going to find in this passage, we're not talking about a single individual or one or two. We are finding that this is just in general a set of people. So God is not specifically going to be speaking to anyone particular. It's just that we're looking at this group of people who are the result of descendants after the flood. Now they are, I guess they really like each other. They've decided to stay close to each other. And what I want you to think about here is, where is God in their thinking or in their action? And notice it's, let us come build ourselves a city to reach the heavens so that we can make a name for ourselves. So fame is nothing new. This is something that is an old age concept that mankind has always wanted to pursue. They want to make a name for themselves. And it says, otherwise will be scattered. Interesting, because they don't want to go in different directions. They all want to stay together. And so that is an aspect we're going to look at this next piece, because you see, in Genesis 9:7, he has commanded them to be fruitful and to increase in number on the earth. And if we go back to 9:7, it says, as for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it. Yep, that may not really come as clear there, but understand that the earth is large. Like, it's not just one little location, and they all need to stay with each other. This is the impression that I have, and maybe you can see that as well, that he wants the whole earth to just be filled with people who worship him. That would be God. You know, if God has a dream, that would be the dream. And he wants them to see this world. And here we find that they're not moving. So I really want you to notice here that they, in this first four verses, say that 7 times fast, and realize that they have rejected God. In this, where is God in their thinking? And he's not even listening. So we're going to see next where God enters. And it's verses 11:5-7. Here we go. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. In verse 7, come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other. Again, I've 3 verses there packed together, and yet there's a lot to consider. Then the backdrop again is Genesis 9:7, where God has asked him after the flood. He's talking to Noah at that time, and to let him know that he and his descendants, he and his sons, and then they were to have children and grandchildren and so forth, that they are to be in all of the earth. He wants more of humanity. They have a chance to get to start over, and that's what this. Now, it's not I want to make sure you understand that it's not about obedience that I'm talking about here. It's it's the perspective of where God is in their lives. Where you see in the first 4 verses, there's no mention of God whatsoever. It's about themselves. It's about them having a name for themselves so that they can be famous, so that they can be known for something in history. And there's no recognition of God whatsoever. So you hear God, or here we have God coming down, so to speak. And that's another aspect that I love about what it must sound like and mean in through the Hebrew language, being read through that, because the Hebrew language, maybe like most languages, very picturesque, depictive we call it, so you can see things with the language. And so here we find that God is depicted like human, like us. He comes down to visit. He's he's actually given human movement. And if you and I really think about it, we say that God is everywhere at once. God is spirit. So he doesn't need to just come and visit and make a presence. No, he's everywhere, right? But I love how it's stated here that he comes down to visit. And again, it goes into God is always personal. He's always trying to have a relationship with mankind. So here he comes. He comes down. He's going to look at the city. And again, I laugh as I think about that. I'm like, wow, what would that be? But anyway, he does come down, and and I always call it that God talks with himself. And unlike us, when we talk to ourselves, it's just us that we hear our own voice. Whereas with God, when he talks to himself, he's actually doing the plural in one. And so he's talking with himself, and again, we don't know how to explain the Trinity, but it occurs. And here's another example of he's plural in one God. And they are he who is they come to the plain of Shinar. We're looking at this a little more closely, and it says, he said, if one people speaking the same language, they've done this because they can all understand each other, they can, assist each other in their tasks. And I'm adding more, I'm trying to get you to understand what that can mean. Then there's nothing that they can plan to do that will be impossible for them. So if they have everything going for them, especially if they understand each other, then he's saying that they can imagine things and come up with things, and mankind can just, you know, just come up with, like I said, they can do what he calls the impossible. And so more than that, and again, it's not the fact that they disobeyed. Yes, yes, they disobeyed him. He wanted them to go out and to see all of the world, and they stay together. So yes, that's disobedience. And even more so is the obstinance of, meaning they're stubborn, they're stubborn people. They've rejected God. They don't have him in their lives. And that's the killer piece. There's no reflection here in these verses that that anybody was seeking God, anybody was paying attention to him, worshiping him. Now, here we go, and we see that God says that he's come down, and he is he decides that this is the consequence for what they have done. Their rejection of him must be punished. And here we are. And he says, come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other. Again, why would he have done that? I'm not sure all the details, but he did at least give us a bit of a clue in the moments just right before. And that is where he says that if they keep this up and they all speak the same language, they can all communicate and they can all get the same idea, then they'll just keep going. Who knows what more? The Lord knows. But He is saying that the people will get the idea that they're invincible. They can do whatever they need, and they don't need God anymore. They certainly don't need Him. If they have one language and they don't need Him now, what's to come. But at least here He has looked at this and for His and His infinite wisdom has decided that He's going to invent languages and bring them in. He's going to confuse their speech so that they don't understand each other, because they're invincible when they all speak the same language and they can keep going and on and on and on. So there needs to be a check on their desires, a check on their imaginations and their inventions. So here we go. We're going to finish up and look at that. So that again, we looked at the rejection of God, and now we've looked at the recon of God, as I say, because this is where God has actually come down to visit. So I hear it on the movies that people do recon, they're checking things out and seeing what's going on. And I decided to use that word, reconnaissance by God, that's what God's doing. He's come down and he's looked around, and then he gives a bit of judgment or at least a consequence on the rejection that the people have done in terms of rejecting him as their God, and that he should be in number one in their lives, and he's nothing in their life. So then we look at the next piece here. Sorry, look down. Let's go Genesis 11, 8 through 9. So it's still a couple of verses. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. This is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So those are the two verses, 8 and 9. And again, I like to say, still power packed, maybe two verses, but there are things we can take from this. So now we see that the Lord has given a consequence, that they're going to speak differently, and they can't understand each other. This is where we say the languages first came. And the process, I mean, can you imagine speaking one language and then the next day just not being able to understand each other? And suddenly, if you're working on a project, you all have to have the same, it helps to have the same language, it helps to understand where you're going, everybody work together, and that's not going to happen. Apparently, they can't understand each other. Perhaps they get angry at each other. All the building has to, and construction stops because they just don't belong anymore and they can't understand what the other is saying. And so the communication is broken down, and then therefore this whole construction project is finished because they can't go any further. And then it says in verse 8 there that what happens is not only do they speak different languages, they don't finish their tower, but they also scatter. And this is in line with what God had wanted. They had remained together and they were determined to stay together. And this way, now with the languages, and they just, for a lot of different reasons, perhaps, they decide that they just don't want to live near each other again. And in the end, they scatter. And that makes sense to us now, as why there are different languages in different areas. And some of them are quite similar, right? And and languages have a way of developing throughout years. Okay. Now, let's also see that it says that they also stopped building the city. So it was going to be a huge city. It was going to be all of them together. Well, the city's not going to be as big, or if at all, a city. I'm not quite sure. But it says that this is why it was called Babel, that because the Lord confused them. So in the Hebrew language, apparently the Babel is considered to be derived as confusion. So this is the reason we call it Babel. Interestingly enough, and it may be just the way that I'm pronouncing it with my Oklahoma accent, that Babel also sounds like, Babble, what we hear in the English word that we use, which means like making nonsensical speech, which is just basically syllables repeated over and over again, and it means nothing. It's just rubbish. And that, interestingly enough, sounds like Babel, the name of the place, but then not necessarily the Babel that we use in our English language is exactly derived from this. It's interesting. It's real close. And we like to say that it could be from that, but in reality, the word that we use is actually from derives from a Germanic language, and so it derives from that, and so this babble came from baby talk, blah blah blah, that kind of thing, and then that is something that developed over time. So anyway, here we're saying that in the Hebrew word for it is confusion that we would use in English as the word confusion. Anyway, that in case you might have heard that this is where we get the word Babel. Yeah, maybe, but it's a long time in coming over years, if that's the case. Let me go further with the city of Babel here. That is also the location that is considered Babylon. And that Babylon was in modern day Iraq. And that's the city that we hear famously throughout different parts of Scripture, all the way to the book of Revelation. So this is interesting, I think, because this could be the first location of trying to build a city that is uh, going to show up in the times of the kings, and then it's also going to show up in the book of Revelation. So Babylon is a location, and that's where we believe that Babylon comes from, this location as well. And then we know that the people in the long run have scattered from that location. Babylon never really becomes a great city, and particularly the very first city here doesn't doesn't go anywhere either, so its construction stops and the people end up being scattered. So the review by God looking at that is that he has seen that they scatter, they have different languages now, and their original intent of making a name for themselves, they had to abandon the project. They abandoned the construction of the huge tower that was going to reach the heavens. Yeah, it's over. And to go to the heavens but not reach him. Well, there you go. You see there that the people rejected him, and God came in and looked at it and says, okay, this we're going to confuse the languages so that they have to stop, and it's over. Okay? And so then let me go back through real quickly over everything, and that is that God is in the series. God is a personal God who decides to come down and visit the city. That's one thing. Then God is a God who desires a relationship. And here we find that he has been rejected by all the people. And he so dearly wanted to be in their lives. And then we know that God is a God of salvation. And that here we see that God could he could provide salvation for her. He could be there. But they have rejected him, and the people have have to go. They have to move. And he originally had asked them to do that. He originally wanted them to do that, was to go and be willing to spread out under in the earth, all over the earth. But they didn't do that, and so now they have to. And then that explains why we have in different areas of the world, we have different languages. And the languages all developed from this moment with the people. It also is the backdrop that you see of why now the people are from, they're going to be the scattering. I'm going to comment on that. The scattering happens, and we can see now why it would be important that God would choose one people to know him, to worship him, to show, and he could show them his love, and that would be his example for the rest of the world of how he loves. So here is also the beginning of the concept of a nation, of a people who would love him, and that he would make certain that they uh, could share who he is to the rest of the world. So there's the setting for it. We now have the backdrop that leads to the idea of a people that's going to be chosen by him that would show who he is. And a people who, in the midst of them, would eventually have that promised one that he has promised from Genesis 3:15. Anyway, food for thought. I just wanted you to look at that. I have a worksheet for you as well, so if you enjoy that and working with that as well. And just to get you to think about a lot of different things. And to especially think about how God, and I'll bring you back, that God is the commander. God has commanded us to do different things. And God has commanded us to, well, let me back up. In this particular thing, God has commanded the people to scatter, to go on into all the earth, to all the earth, and to be fruitful and multiply, so that there's more of them, and the population is. But also, for us, it is for us to, um, I believe, I would suggest that the original intent was to know who he was as you're going, and that these people should have hopefully would have known who he was, had a relationship with him, and understood him, that he was bringing salvation to them eventually down the line. And in all the process, it got lost. That we now have to, in today's time, go out and share who Christ is. And so now we look back because we now know who the promised one is. If you don't know that promised one, certainly I know anyone of the church. If you have any questions, contact the church. And there are church members who would be more than happy to tell you, and even me, I would love to tell you how great God is and that he's provided us salvation. So I don't want you to miss out on that. But I also want you to know that God has commanded us to know him, to love him, but to really share his gospel with others. And I encourage you to do that, and encourage you as you're going to do that and share who he is and his love. Thank you very much for being with us. Have a great day. Thank you.